Boom, and just like that, it is week 9 of the fantasy season, so you know exactly what that means. We're going to go through every single matchup, talk about every single wide receiver, and go over who you should be starting and who you should be sitting here in week 9 of the fantasy season. All right, very quickly here, we have 4 teams on bye week here in week 9, the Cleveland Browns, the New York Jets, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and the Philadelphia Eagles. So make sure you guys are checking your lineups and making adjustments accordingly. Let's kick it off with Thursday Night Football. We will have the Ravens traveling to face the Dolphins. Let's start with Zay Flowers and the Baltimore Ravens. Zay Flowers continues to be a solid low-end start on a week-to-week basis. It looks as if we should be getting Lamar Jackson back here in week 9 of the season, as he has been dealing with that injury, but hopefully we are getting Lamar Jackson back. Nonetheless, with Tyler Huntley at quarterback, Zay Flowers was still solid against the Chicago Bears. 9 targets, 7 catches, 63 receiving yards, 14.1 fantasy points. It's not a great matchup against the Dolphins. They have actually given up the fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers so far on this season. Part of that is because they give up so many points to the running back position. So I don't want to overreact too much here to the matchup. I still think Flowers, good low-end start. Definitely better if we do see Lamar Jackson back at quarterback, but nonetheless, he is a good start for you guys here in week 9 of the season. Then we look to the Dolphins. Jalen Waddle in the start category, 20.9 fantasy points this past week, 6 targets, 5 catches, 99 receiving yards, and a touchdown. And the Ravens have given up the second most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers on the season. Most weeks, Jalen Waddle's also in that low-end start kind of tier, but due to the matchup here, feel really good about Jalen Waddle as we approach the weekend. Thursday Night Football, for the most part this year, has been pretty high scoring, so got to feel good if you do own Jalen Waddle. I know Malik Washington finally did something this past week against the Falcons, found the end zone, and the passing attack for the Dolphins looked really good overall. 5 targets, 4 catches, 36 receiving yards, and a touchdown for Washington, but we still haven't seen anything consistent come out of Malik Washington since Tyreek Hill headed to IR, so I'm going to leave him in the sit category, but maybe he could be like a very risky flex for those of you guys who are dealing with bye week issues, but I'm going to leave him as a sit. But Flowers, Waddle should both be solid starts here in week 9 of the season. And I'm headed straight to Underdog to take the over on Jalen Waddle's receiving yards here in week 9. Currently sitting at 63.5 receiving yards. He has hit that mark in 3 of the last 4 games, and this is a fantastic matchup at home against the Ravens. So don't forget, all new users who sign up on Underdog using promo code THECATCH are getting a free NFL Pick'em to use towards week 9 NFL action. Take that free Pick'em, take Waddle's total on receiving yards, and if both of those lines hit, you'll automatically double your cash entry. And on top of that, once you play through $5 on Underdog, as long as you sign up using promo code THECATCH, that link is down below, you're going to receive $50 in bonus cash to use towards week 9 NFL action. And Underdog is also going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So make sure you guys sign up on Underdog using promo code THECATCH. That link is down below. Moving into Sunday's action, let's kick it off with the early window, which is going to start with the Niners traveling to face the Giants. And, well, I guess we should start with the San Francisco 49ers wide receiver room. That is a complete dart throw and mess on a week-to-week basis. Kendrick Bourne, just 7.4 fantasy points this past week. We did see Jawan Jennings active this past week, just 8.5 fantasy points. And we continue to see Ricky Pearsall sidelined. He does have potential to play in week 9. We also don't know if at this point in the week if Mac Jones or Brock Purdy is going to be the starting quarterback for the Niners. I'm not sure it really matters. Mac Jones, for the most part, has been solid enough, but I do think it's better if it's Brock Purdy. This is still a really good matchup. The Giants are bottom 6 against opposing wide receivers so far on the season, and they have been one of the worst. They've actually been the worst team in the league against opposing wide receivers in terms of total yardage allowed to the position. So it's a good spot for these Niners wide receivers, but they all impact each other in terms of who's playing or who's not playing. It looks like Jennings is probably going to be good to go week 9 as he played this past week and had no injuries pop up, which has happened previously in the season. But if Pearsall plays, I think that impacts Jennings and Bourne. And then Bourne has less value if Brock Purdy's at quarterback. So they're all risky flexes, but it's a really good matchup. So bear that in mind if you guys do need to start a Niners wide receiver this weekend. Then I have Rondell Robinson as a low-end start. 7.8 fantasy points this past week against the Eagles. 4 targets, 3 catches, 48 receiving yards after having 15.5 or more fantasy points in 2 straight games. So the Niners are still bottom 12 against opposing wide receivers on the position. He's really the true pass catcher on this team at the wide receiver position, although we did get a little bit of involvement from Darius Slayton this past week, who had 5 targets and 2 catches, but nothing really there. And then, Theo Johnson at tight end. There are other options, but in terms of the wide receiver position, it's basically Robinson, and that's it. Cam Scatterbo, unfortunately, out of the mix now for the remainder of the season, who was getting some receiving work as well. Maybe that helps Robinson. Not a bad matchup. I'm just going to leave him as a low-end start because there's not really anybody else to throw to on this team. Lil Jordan Humphrey appeared in week 6, then disappeared. Jalen Hyatt, who you do see on the screen, has been injured. So it's Robinson. He's a low-end start, nothing better, hopefully nothing worse here in week 9. And next up, we have the Chargers traveling to face the Titans and what is probably going to be a one-sided affair. Let's start with the Chargers wide receivers. Got Ladd McConkey this week as a start, 20.8 fantasy points in week 8 against the Vikings. 10 targets, 6 catches, 88 receiving yards, and a touchdown. He now has a touchdown in 3 of the last 4 games and 14.9 or more fantasy points in each of the last 4 games. So gotta feel good if you own Ladd McConkey. It's a great matchup against the Titans. They have been awful against opposing wide receivers, bottom 10 in terms of fantasy points allowed to the position. Ladd McConkey is as good as a start you're going to get this week. Now, I have moved Keenan Allen and Quentin Johnston down to the flex category. Originally, still kind of viewed them as like low-end starts, but we looked at this past week. Quentin Johnston, 0 fantasy points, 0 targets after having a touchdown, and 11 fantasy points the previous week. Then Keenan Allen, 8.4 fantasy points after having 28.9 fantasy points in a receiving touchdown the week before. Now, this is a really good matchup. It's a better matchup than what they got against the Vikings, and also that game script last week, they just didn't need to throw the football at the end of the day. So I don't know that they're going to need to throw the football a ton this week against the Titans, but it is a good and better matchup than it was against the Vikings. So I like Keenan Allen. I like Quentin Johnston. I think they are both really good flex options, but due to the way that the football is being spread around in this Chargers offense, I don't want to call them more than that. But don't be panicking or freaking out if you have to start either of these guys. They're still good options this week. Now, when it comes to the Titans offense, I don't really want to start anybody. I just don't think this is a good spot. The offense has been absolutely anemic. The passing attack is just not there. The Chargers, a top 10 unit against opposing wide receivers on the season. Cam Ward has not been playing at an NFL level at the quarterback position. The play calling's bad. It's just all bad across the board here. I do like Chimere DK, who we've talked about in some of the waiver videos and stash videos over the past 2 weeks. If you guys have to start a Titans wide receiver, it would be DK for me, who's had 16.4 or more fantasy points in 2 straight games and either a touchdown or at least 7 receptions in each of the last 2 games. So he's an option, but at the same time, I just feel like this is not going to be a good day for the Titans, but felt the same way last week, and DK still came through with 16.4 fantasy points. But yeah, Calvin Ridley missed this past week, maybe getting traded, who knows. And then Alec Manor, is still doing something at 9.2 fantasy points this past week, 8 targets, 4 catches. But yeah, I just don't want any part of the Titans offense. And my starting lineup, or your guys' starting lineup, in week 9, we'll see how things shake out. All right, next up, we will have a divisional matchup between the Vikings and the Lions. Let's start with the Vikings side of things. Justin Jefferson, even in a really bad overall night for The Vikings still had 14.4 fantasy points in week 8, 11 targets, 7 catches, 74 receiving yards, and Jordan Addison was also solid, 11.6 fantasy points, 4 targets, 3 catches, 26 receiving yards, and found the end zone. So Addison, double digits in his last 4 games. Justin Jefferson, double digits every game this year. Looks like we're probably going to get J.J. McCarthy at quarterback here in week 9, and if it's not McCarthy, I would guess it's Max Brosmer, because I don't think Carson Wentz is going to be able to play after that shoulder injury that he played through this past week. So it'll probably be J.J. McCarthy. I don't know if that's good or bad for these receivers, but I don't think it's going to matter. They both seem to come through regardless of the quarterback play. The Lions still dealing with a lot of injuries on defense. They are coming out of their bye week, so that's going to help them get that extra rest and prepare and all of that. And their backups played pretty dang good the last time we saw this team in action in week 7. So with all that being said, I still think JJ and Addison are starts, and I think that you should still feel very good if you own either of these Vikings wide receivers, and this should probably be another game script where, regardless of who the quarterback is, the Vikings are forced to throw the football. All right, the Lions are coming out of their bye week, but you already know that you're starting Amon-Ra St. Brown on a week-to-week basis. It's not a great matchup. The Vikings have been good against opposing wide receivers, top 7 against the position on the season. But you are starting Amon-Ra St. Brown no matter what. If you guys own him, he's giving you double digits in every game this year except for week 1 of the season, and 18 or more fantasy points in every game except for 2 so far on the season, with 7 touchdowns through the first 7 games of the year. So absolute must-start wide receiver every single week. Jameson Williams is the riskiest flex you could ever potentially start, and that's all I'm going to call him for the rest of the year. Week 7, 0 points. Week 6, 18.6 points. Pretty good representation. So would I feel comfortable starting J-Mo if I owned him? No, I don't think so at all. But if you guys want a risky flex option, the upside is there. But keep in mind, the floor is like 0 fantasy points. And we'll just have to leave it at that as we move into week 9. So we have the Falcons traveling to face the Patriots. Let's start with Drake London and the Falcons. Drake London missed this past week against the Dolphins, dealing with a hip injury kind of last minute. Don't know if he's going to play here in week 9 or not, but if he does play, I think you can go ahead and roll with him. I will say, I don't really like this matchup. You know, the Falcons defense, although inconsistent, is still a good unit, I think. This past week, not so much, but and the Patriots defense definitely good. So, you know, then we got like, is Kirk Cousins going to be the quarterback? Is Michael Penix going to be the quarterback? Not quite sure, but I think through all the noise, Drake London will be a solid start if he plays. He has been solid for most of the year, although we haven't seen a crazy high ceiling out of him. If he plays, I'm going to call him a low-end start here in week 9. Haven't really been in on Darnell Mooney on the season, but some people were kind of feeling good about him this past week with no Drake London and then playing the Dolphins. But he had 1 catch for 11 receiving yards. And I just am not comfortable starting Darnell Mooney, even as a flex option. So he's a sit for me. We'll see how things shake out. Don't even know who the quarterback is for the Falcons this early in the week, but I'm not really looking at this Falcons receiver room as anything more than potentially starting Drake London on a week-in, week-out basis. Then we look to the Patriots side of things. Stephon Diggs, a player that I liked a lot going into week 8. He had his first touchdown of the season. Didn't really do anything other than that. Only 3 catches, but he had 10.4 fantasy points. So he just remains a low-end start. Bear in mind, like I said, while inconsistent, this Falcons defense has still allowed the 5th fewest fantasy points to wide receivers on the position. So, or on the season, I'm sorry. So he's a low-end start. Nothing more than that. He still has had double-digit fantasy performances in 4 out of his last 5 games. Kayshon Boutte remains a risky flex. He's getting close to coming out of that risky flex area, though. Another good performance this past week, and it's just like, I mean, the Patriots are throwing the football so much that he always has the chance to score. I mean, 3 straight games with at least 1 receiving touchdown. One of those games, 2 receiving touchdowns, 13.5 or more fantasy points in 3 straight games. So I do like Boutte, but it just kind of depends. If he doesn't get that touchdown, you're not going to be feeling great. I mean, bear in mind, 3 catches this past week, 2 the previous week, 5 in week 6, but I mean, really, the volume is still low overall. So he's still a risky flex for me, but in terms of risky flex options, I do like him a lot because, like I said, the Patriots are throwing the football at one of the highest rates in the entire NFL, but can't call him anything more than a risky flex than any other Patriots wide receiver. Just going to be a sit for me here in week 9. Next up, we have the Colts traveling to face the Steelers. Let's start with the best offense in the NFL, the Indianapolis Colts, who are on the road this week against a Steelers defense that struggles against the wide receiver position, 28th overall in terms of fantasy points allowed to wide receivers, bottom 5. They've given up over 1,200 receiving yards on the season and 6 receiving touchdowns. So, yeah, a lot of these fantasy points are coming from total receptions and receiving yards, but this Colts offense, if I got a piece of it, I'm more than likely starting it. And Michael Pittman just continues to perform on a week in, week out basis. Like, yeah, week 2, he was a bummer. Week 6, he was a bummer. Outside of that, 14.9 or more fantasy points in every game and a touchdown in each of those performances, which means double-digit fantasy performances or a touchdown in 6 of the first 8 games. He's been great this year. You're starting him in this matchup. It's a smash spot for Pittman. Josh Downs continues to be a solid flex option, getting close to moving into the low-end flex or low-end start category. We missed him in week 7, but in his last 3 games, he's had double-digit fantasy performances and 2 touchdowns in that stretch. So I really like Josh Downs this week as well. He's one of my favorite flex options, sitting at 56% rostered. Should be rostered in more fantasy leagues and is definitely a solid enough flex option for you guys. Pretty close to wide receiver 2 territory, but once again, the volume is not incredibly high here. Alec Pierce can always do something. He does get involvement in this offense, but it's just not really consistent enough to reflect a good fantasy outing on a week in, week out basis. He's always a risky flex option, I guess, if you guys have nothing better, a desperation flex option. But you look at the last 3 weeks, 6.8 fantasy points, 14.8, 8.9, too risky for me. Then A.D. Mitchell probably shouldn't even be on the screen. He's really been kind of exiled from this offense. But yeah, Pittman, Downs, very solid here in week 9. DK Metcalf continues to be a really good start on a week-in, week-out basis. Week 7 against the Bengals somehow found a way to not come through in the Unk Bowl when everybody else and their mother scored touchdowns in that game, it felt like. But outside of that, Metcalf has had 11 or more fantasy points every weekend. He has 5 touchdowns through the first 8 weeks of the season, including a week 5 bye week. So Metcalf has been solid, not a crazy high ceiling. But then again, he does have 16.5 or more fantasy points in 3 of the last 4 games. So this is a great matchup. Yes, this Colts team looks phenomenal, but they're so good and they get up by so many points that by the end of the game, opposing teams, opposing offenses just have to throw the football. For that reason, they are a bottom 5 unit against opposing wide receivers, over 1,300 receiving yards allowed and 9 receiving touchdowns allowed on the season as well. So it's a great matchup for Metcalf. He's a very strong start at home here in week 9. Anybody else on this team? Calvin Austin, Roman Wilson, no consistency here. They're going to be sits for me in week 9. Except we have the Broncos traveling to face the Texans. Let's start with the Broncos side of things. Courtland Sutton, just 10.7 fantasy points this past week. 6 targets, 4 catches, 67 receiving yards. On the road here against a stingy Texans defense. Derek Stingley as that number 1 corner. Not a great spot for Courtland Sutton, but I think every week, even if you kind of view him as like a low-end start here in week 9 due to the matchup, he's still a start. Don't forget, he dropped a touchdown in week 8 against the Cowboys, and the previous play before that was a touchdown that got called back. So he was very close to another good stat line and should have had a good stat line against that Cowboys defense. But Sutton, still solid. Maybe not a high ceiling this week, but I think if I own him for the most part, I'm still starting him. Then we look to Troy Franklin, a big week in week 8. 2 touchdowns, 6 catches off of 8 targets, 89 receiving yards, 26.9 fantasy points. But once again, it's not a great matchup here against the Texans, so I think he's a risky flex this week. With 2 solid performances in a row, like his roster percentage is going to go up. He was in the waiver video, but bear in mind, he still has been pretty inconsistent on the season, but the volume has been better over the past 2 weeks. So I think he's a risky flex. I'm not going to call him anything more than that on the road here against the Texans. We are seeing sporadic involvement also out of Pat Bryant and Marvin Mims. Bryant had a touchdown this past week. Marvin Mims shows up at times. He did not show up this past week, but the previous week, 15.8 fantasy points. But yeah, not enough for me to consider starting either of these guys. Then we have the Texans wide receiver room. I had no idea what to do with these guys as we approach the week. Pat Surtain did get banged up this past week. May impact his status for week 9. It looks like Nico Collins is going to play here in week 9, looking at the early week reporting. So as long as he plays, I think he's a low-end start. But yeah, he's been difficult to trust at times throughout the course of the season. But I mean, he had to leave week 7 early. He did have 10 targets in that game. He still has given you double digits in 4 out of 6 games on the year so far. So if he starts, I still think he's a low-end start, but definitely low end if he faces Pat Surtain this week. So could be looking at Sutton, Collins, tough corner matchups depending on their health. Still going to be solid enough for me in week 9. Then, yeah, I know we got lots of involvement out of the Texans wide receivers against the Niners. Xavier Hutchinson scored a touchdown this past week. Jalen Noel had a nice game with 11.3 fantasy points. And then Jaden Higgins also scored a touchdown. So we had double digits out of 3 Texans wide receivers in week 8. I just don't know that it's going to bleed over into week 9 against the Denver Broncos. Plus, Christian Kirk was out this past week on top of Nico Collins. You know, both those guys could be back in week 9. How does that impact the volume for the rest of wide receivers? So I'm not even going to try. I'm just going to bench all the Texans wide receivers unless Nico Collins plays here in week 9 of the fantasy season. All right, next up we have the Bears traveling to face the Bengals. Let's start with the Bears and Rome Odunze, who had a solid Week 8 performance, 18.4 fantasy points, 10 targets, 7 catches, 114 receiving yards. I like him this week against the Bengals. Bear in mind, the Bengals are okay against opposing wide receivers. Like, I know a lot of people see the Bengals defense and they just think, oh, yep, I'm starting whoever, but they are 13th overall against opposing wide receivers, so not awful. They have given up over 1,100 receiving yards and 5 receiving touchdowns. I mean, it's not great, but it's certainly not bad. But I still think Rome Odunze is a start on a week-to-week basis. Now, the passing attack didn't really look fluent this past week, in a good spot against the Ravens, but I still think Rome Odunze is plenty worth starting. Kind of frustrating to see him not score a touchdown this past week in what was a really good matchup. Nonetheless, I'll just leave him as a good start here in week 9. DJ Moore, I'll put as a flex. Once again, there's opportunity here against a bad Bengals defense, but they're just really not that bad against opposing wide receivers. So DJ Moore can always do something. He's worthy of the flex, but you know, if he doesn't get enough receptions, enough receiving yards, or score a touchdown, you're not going to feel good. And so far, he only has double digits in 2 games on the season out of 7 total performances for the Bears. So flex, but honestly should probably be a risky flex. But I do think that there's potential for this game to turn a bit high scoring, so I do think that will help DJ Moore potentially. But on top of that, Luther Burden's also banged up, so there's potential. Depends on who else you guys got. All right, when we look to the Bengals wide receivers going up against the Bears this week, I mean, you got to feel good if you own Jamar Chase and or T. Higgins. Not the worst spot, not the best. The Bears come in 19th overall against opposing wide receivers in terms of fantasy points allowed. But if you own Jamar Chase, you're starting him no matter what. He didn't find the end zone this past week, but he still had 21 fantasy points. He's been great over the past 4 weeks or so. And, you know, whether it was Joe Flacco or not at quarterback, he's been good. But since week 6, he's been great with Joe Flacco with 21 or more fantasy points, 12 or more targets, 10 or more catches, and 2 touchdowns in that stretch. So Chase, absolute must start no matter what. You guys already know that. T. Higgins remains a very solid start, 11.4 fantasy points this past week. Only had 2 targets, only had 1 catch, but it was a 44-yard receiving touchdown. He has had 11.2 or more fantasy points and at least a touchdown in 2 of the last 3 games with Joe Flacco at quarterback. So you got to feel good about Higgins as well in the low end start category, but I think you should still feel good if you own T. Higgins here in week 9. All right, final game of the early window is going to be the Panthers traveling to face the Packers. Let's start with the Panthers side of things. T-Mac continues to be a low-end start on a week-to-week basis. Gets the Packers this week. And I think, once again, like, the people look at this Packers defense and think, like, oh, I don't know, it's a tough defense, but they're bottom 10 against opposing wide receivers on the season. It's not a bad spot for T-Mac. 10 targets this past week, 7 catches, 99 receiving yards, 16.9 fantasy points. He's had double digits in every game this year except for 2, so if I own him, solid start. Not a lot of crazy upside here. Don't know who the quarterback's going to be, whether it's going to be Andy Dalton or Bryce Young, but I would still feel good throwing T-Mac in my starting lineup. Any other Panthers wide receiver, just no thank you. There's no consistency here. Nothing really emerging that can give us any hope from a fantasy perspective. So it's T-Mac or nothing for the Panthers wide receivers. Then we look to the Packers. I mean, this is another one of those wide receiver rooms where it's just risky flexes across the board on a week-to-week basis. Definitely feel the most comfortable with Romeo Doubs, but he didn't do a whole lot this past week. 9.4 fantasy points, 3 catches, 44 receiving yards. Did have the 2-point conversion, but yeah, just not a lot here. Christian Watson's back in the mix. He had a long reception, 4 catches, 85 receiving yards, 12.5 fantasy points, which is maybe going to hurt the potential fantasy value of Matthew Golden, but just the nature of this offense, he could always get involvement as well. Keep in mind, this Panthers defense is nothing to necessarily sneeze at. They've given up the 3rd fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers, so you're really pushing the envelope if you're going for a Matthew Golden or Christian Watson this week, but we could consider them risky flexes. Desperation flexes is probably more what they're looking at. Dontavion Wicks was inactive this past week as well. So definitely feel the best about Dobbs here, but it's a tough matchup even at home. I'm not calling the Packers wide receivers anything other than risky flexes as we move into the weekend. Next up, we have the Saints traveling to face the Rams to kick off the first of the afternoon games. And let's go ahead and start with Chris Olave and the Saints. And Chris Olave is just going to remain a solid start on a week-to-week basis. 14 fantasy points this past week. Even with a carousel at the quarterback position, he had 12 targets, 8 catches, 63 receiving yards. Don't know if we're going to get Tyler Shuck or Spencer Rattler or both this week. Don't really know that there was any stat line this past week that would sway in the direction of either quarterback. But like I said, luckily, it doesn't really matter if you guys own Chris Olave. He's been solid all year long with double-digit fantasy points in every game this year. Not always the highest ceiling, but the floor very safe. And the Rams are bottom 12 against opposing wide receivers. So I like Olave this week. Very good start. Rashid Shaheed did leave week 8 with an injury. We'll see how things shake out if he's able to go week 9 or not. But he did have 14.5 fantasy points this past week. 12 targets, 9 catches, 75 receiving yards. He's always in the risky flex category, can always give you that upside. We'll have to see if he's healthy or not this week, but I'll leave him as a risky flex, and I think that's fair. Now we look to the Rams wide receivers going into week 9. It looks like Puka Nacua is expected to play, but you never know. Last minute, we could get a different indication, but coming out of the bye week, extra time to prepare and rest. If you guys own Puka Nacua and he starts, it doesn't matter who he's playing. You guys are starting him every single week. Worth noting that the Saints are top 10 against the wide receiver position in terms of fantasy points allowed. But if Puka Nacua is out there, if he's deemed healthy, you are starting him. I think the same goes for Devontae Adams, who's given you double digits in every game this year except for 2. And through the first 7 weeks of the season, had 6 receiving touchdowns. 3 of them in week 7, but still, he's one of the top wide receivers in the league in terms of red zone looks. He's been great this year, and actually, I think, even with Puka Nacua on the field, that can be a good thing for times, or a good thing at times for Devontae Adams, because there's less defensive pressure that can open up things, especially in the red zone for Devontae Adams. So, if you own Adams, you're also starting him with 100% confidence if you guys own them as we move into week 9. Next up, we have the Jaguars traveling to face the Raiders. This is certainly an interesting one for the wide receiver position. Let's start with the Jaguars. I kind of just have risky flex options across the board here for this Jaguars wide receiver room. I know there were rumors about Brian Thomas potentially being traded. I don't think there's a lot of merit to that. I don't think it makes a lot of sense given that he's still on a rookie contract, but maybe that's a thing. He has been a little banged up as of late, I think he's going to be good to go ultimately here in week 9 against the Raiders. So I think if you own him, he's still in the risky flex category, but it's a good matchup. This Raiders defense has not been good against wide receivers, bottom 5 in terms of fantasy points allowed. So I think if you own him, certainly worth a flex spot. Travis Hunter, a big week 7, 14 targets, 8 catches, 101 receiving yards, a touchdown, 24 fantasy points. I'm not ready to move him out of the risky flex category, though. I mean, don't forget, he hasn't hit double-digit fantasy points in any game other than week 7 this year, but it is a good matchup. We could see more involvement out of him as well as the season progresses. So leave him as a very risky flex, but the upside is there. Then, Parker Washington has had some moments on the season, had 10 fantasy points in week 7, so risky desperation flex. Can't call him anything more than that. And then once again, I don't really know how this game script's going to go if the Jags are going to need to throw the football a ton. So I think Parker Washington, just a true desperation flex, not even in the same necessary category as Brian Thomas or Travis Hunter. Then we move to the Raiders wide receivers. Jakobi Meyers did miss week 7. Unclear if there's going to be a trade here as well involving Jakobi Meyers or not. That would definitely impact the rest of the Raiders wide receivers. But the time recording this, don't know anything certain for sure. So if he starts for the Raiders, I think he is still a risky flex. This is still a good matchup. The Jags 26 overall against the opposing wide receivers on the season. They've given up 10 receiving touchdowns on the season, over 1,000 receiving yards. So it's a good spot here at home. Just don't know how great the quarterback play is going to be for the Raiders this week. But Myers, always a risky flex, but the ceiling has been pretty low since week 3 of the season. Then Trey Tucker, also in the risky flex category. He would definitely benefit if Jakobi Meyers is no longer on this team or sits again in week 9, but can't call him more than a risky flex. In terms of Donta Thornton or Jack Bech, I don't think they're really going to have any relevancy unless Jakobi Meyers is traded, but even then, not risking them here in week 9 of the fantasy season. The final game of the afternoon slate, probably going to be the best game of the week. It'll be the Chiefs traveling to face the Bills. Should probably be the Sunday night football game, but that's okay. Final game of the afternoon slate. I am recording this before Monday Night Football has been played for week 8, so if any injuries happen, if anything happens that changes my mind, there will be a pinned comment down below. But in terms of the Chiefs wide receivers for now, Rashee Rice in the start category. Gotta feel good if you guys own him, really regardless of what happens in Monday Night Football, because this matchup against the Bills should be a high-scoring affair. It's a tough matchup against the Bills. They have been top 10 against opposing wide receivers, but if you own Rashee Rice and he's good to go, you're going to start him. Then Xavier Worthy, Hollywood Brown, always risky flex options. They get that red zone involvement. The Chiefs spread the football around a lot, and you got to imagine they're going to come out here swinging against the Bills. Tyquan Thornton, Juju Smith-Schuster will pop up at times, I'm sure, but not enough confidence to call them even risky flex options. So we'll see how things shake out. And once again, if anything crazy happens in Monday Night Football, there'll be a comment down below. Khalil Shakir is really the only Bills wide receiver that I can ever trust, and he's just a low-end start for me. I know he popped off this past week with that long touchdown, 7 targets, 6 grabs, 88 receiving yards, and a touchdown. And he does this. He pops off at times. He scores touchdowns, but he also kind of disappears at times. But he's still a solid low-end start on a week-to-week basis, even in a tough matchup against the Chiefs, who are still top 10 against opposing wide receivers on the season. Keon Coleman, Josh Palmer, anybody left over here, just can't consider them from a fantasy perspective. There's no true consistency. At least Khalil Shakir is consistent. Probably at worst going to get you around 11 fantasy points, but if he scores, should get you over that mark. So Khalil Shakir, good low-end start in what should be a good competitive matchup here in week 9 of the fantasy season. Sunday Night Football, we have the Seahawks traveling to face the Commanders. Jackson Smith-Njigba, absolute must-start wide receiver. Doesn't matter who he is playing on a week-to-week basis. Heading into week 9, even coming out of his bye week, he's the wide receiver 1 in half PPR, the wide receiver 2 in full PPR. You are starting him no matter what. Doesn't matter what the matchup is. Just start him. We don't need to really break it down. He's been absolutely dominant this year. Cooper Kupp, Torrey Horton. I mean, listen, these guys can always pop up, make appearances, but they haven't really done a whole lot over the past week, so maybe they could be desperation flex options if you guys really can't find anything better. but I'm not going to consider them starts. Going to leave them in the sit category here in week 9. I mean, if you own JSN, you feel great, and that's really all we can say for the Seahawks wide receiver room. Once again, I am recording this before week 8. Monday Night Football has been played, so if anything crazy happens with the Commanders wide receivers, I will drop you guys a comment down below. But I think Deebo Samuel has earned, his spot in the start category. I'm not really expecting the Commanders to have a great night against the Chiefs on the road and Arrowhead against that Chiefs defense with Mariota at quarterback, but anything can happen. There's always garbage time, so I'll leave Deebo as a start, but this is a tough matchup. The Seahawks defense, nothing to sneeze at. They are kind of middle of the pack in terms of fantasy points allowed to wide receivers, but I'll leave Deebo as a start, and I'm still going to leave Terry McLaurin in the risky flex category because, I mean, he's going to be active for, return in week 8 coming off of his injury, dealing with that quad injury, but he really hasn't done a whole lot on the season so far. So he's a risky flex, and then that's going to leave, Luke McCaffrey, Jalen Lane, Chris Moore, anybody else here in the sit category, as we move into week 9 of the fantasy season. All right, let's wrap it up with Monday Night Football. We will have the Cardinals traveling to face the Cowboys. The Cardinals coming out of their bye week. I'm going to have Marvin Harrison Jr. in the start category because he is facing the team that has allowed the most fantasy points to wide receivers in the Dallas Cowboys. Over 1,300 receiving yards allowed, 15 receiving touchdowns. This is a smash spot, regardless of if we see Kyler Murray or Jacoby Brissett at the quarterback position in week 9 for the Cardinals. If you own MH Jr., I know the last 2 weeks haven't been great. Just ignore it. Take the matchup. It's a smash spot against the Cowboys. Anybody else here, Greg Dortch, Michael Wilson, they're just going to be sits. Even in a good matchup, can't risk these guys in our fantasy lineups. George Pickens, CeeDee Lamb, both came out with solid performances against the Broncos in week 8. CeeDee Lamb, 14.6 fantasy points, 10 targets, 7 grabs, 74 receiving yards. Pickens, 14.8 fantasy points, 9 targets, 7 receptions, 78 receiving yards. Listen, the Cowboys offense was, I guess, arguably disappointing in week 8, but it was a tough matchup on the road. We just know they're going to throw the football so much that we somewhat expect more out of Pickens and Lamb on a week-to-week basis. Lamb had a big week 7. Pickens kind of came back to earth with 12.2 fantasy points, but you just got to start both these guys on a week-to-week basis. Pickens is a top 5 fantasy wide receiver, and Lamb is getting back into the mix after missing, essentially 4 weeks of the season. So keep these guys in your starting lineups. I mean, the Cardinals secondary has been kind of, to a degree, underrated on the season. They've only allowed 3 total receiving touchdowns, but they do give up a fair amount of receptions and receiving yards, and they have been in and out of injuries in the secondary as well. So I don't think we need to break it down any further than that. Lamb, Pickens should be solid on a week-in, week-out basis. If you guys own them, they should be in your starting lineups as we move into week 9 of the season. You guys have it, every single wide receiver, every single matchup, who you should be starting, who you should be sitting here in week 9 of the fantasy season. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering as many fantasy football questions as I can in the comment section down below. So if you guys need anything whatsoever moving into week 9 of the season, make sure you guys drop me a comment. I'll answer as many as I can throughout the week. And while you guys are down there, it does me a huge favor. It helps out the channel tremendously if you guys hit that subscribe button and that like button on the way out. And when the videos and playlists pop up on the screen, make sure you guys go check out all of our week 9 fantasy content as the week progresses. We're going to have everything that you could possibly need to dominate this week and every coming week of the fantasy season. So with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.